The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, good afternoon, good day. Hello again. This is Justin from Toronto, Canada, Christie, here to do another edition of Widget Designer Gamification. I've got wonderful colleague Janina as the moderator today, and here we go. Let's get started. So today we're going to be doing our design on a target practice game. So again, we're going to go through kind of the process of building it. This time, instead of building it from scratch, I've already built it into the widget, and we'll be running through how it works, just in the interest of making things a little bit more clear and easier to follow and a little bit quicker. So let's get started. So we have, obviously, we need to do our planning for any widget that we do, any game that we do especially. We need to figure out the game logic. We're building this inside of the previous widget that we built with the memory game. So we'll get into that as well when we look into how the logic works. We're going to do a bit of review here again, very quickly from the webinar, my first webinar that I did a few weeks ago. So we'll be starting with if statements. We'll be using if statements. We'll be using switch statements. We will be using loop statements, and again, we'll be using JSON to store our files, to store our data. If statement, again, we have if comes in, if it's true, we do an action. If it's false, we do a different action, and then we continue on with our script. A switch, we have our variable coming in to our switch that we want to test. We have our conditions, if it's true, if it's false, and if it's true, it does the action and exits the switch function. If it's false, it continues through until it finds something that is true, or it does the default action if everything is false, which is optional, of course. We have our loop count. We have our code inside of a loop. We start with a number. We increase the number. If we have 1 to 10, the loop would run 10 times, and then it would exit. JSON, and we'll look at the JSON in a moment. So we have our gamification logic. So we have to make Pandora's Box do what we want it to do, because we're using Pandora's Box as the interface for the user and to show the user their interface to play the game. We have our Widget Designer interaction, which is where the logic takes place for the game. So we've got Widget Designer and Pandora's Box connected together. We'll look into that as well. From the Widget Designer, we're controlling Pandora's Box's layers and sequences. Again, we'll look at that. So the target practice, the target game's logic. To play the game, of course, the game starts. One target will flip up. One target will flip up. It waits for it to be hit. Once the target is hit, the target flips back down, and a new target flips up. So which is the new target that flips up? We'll be using a randomizer. We'll check if it's unique, so we can have a new target flip up every time, and it's not the same one that's going to be flipping up over and over again. And we also have a moving target, so we're going to be using a node to move that single layer. And if we decide to, we can keep the score. So let's look at our Pandora's Box setup. Pandora's Box, this is where all of our targets are placed. And we can see we have one layer that's moving back and forth. That's pretty simple. And what I've done to make it so the layers flip properly. So that's this top center layer. If I change my X rotation, you can see it flips backwards. So to do that, to make it flip not in the center of that layer, I'm using the Y position. So I've moved the rotation pivot of this layer to the very top. And to do that, I simply took the resolution of the whole target and then divided it by 2. So I knew where this was. And because I've also scaled this down, I had to divide it by 2 again. So this image's resolution is 768 divided by 2 to move this up to the top, and divided by 2 again because the scale is 50%. So that gives us a hinge where we can see it flipping up and down. And there's one more setting that we did set up in this this game, and we'll look at that later and why that's been done. So now we'll go to the Widget Designer. So when we start the game with the Widget Designer, there's a few things that happen inside of the widget. So as I said, this is still built on the memory game logic in project. So we can see that this still works, that we built a couple weeks ago. So if I start this one, we switch automatically over. Let's look at how that works. So we can select, we'll use our game selector macro. And we can see in this button, we have select game target. So this is this macro. And in our memory game, we have select game memory. So this is passing an argument to our macro, and that's where it's being received. So let's look at our macro and how it uses that argument. So in here, we have our JSON file or JSON variable that we have set. Our game mode, we're setting to this argument, this parameter. Our text box, we're setting this whole text box up again to display that JSON variable. And then what we do here is I'm pulling from the variable. I'm going to run this. This doesn't matter. Okay. So what I'm doing in this this line is I'm pulling the keys from the game data object inside of here. So this is the game data object, and the first part, the keys are all of the values inside of this JSON. So when I ask for the keys from this object inside of the variable, it's going to return memory and it's going to return target, because those are two of the objects inside of this object. So the reason I'm doing that is when we keep building into this widget, we are going to obviously continue to add games, and we'll keep using this JSON file, this JSON variable to add more data to this, to make this more flexible. So in that case, when we add more games to this, we don't need to keep updating these variables. So when we add another game, this won't save. I'll just do this as an example. So if we add another game here, we put comma and then new game, and then go like this, and that would give us a new game. So now if this were saved into a variable, this is not, this is just in this text box here. This is just an example. So now if I were to call the game JSON.keys again, we would get 3 values, which would be memory, target, and new game. And then what we can do with that is that returns a list. This returns a list. So we can actually count that list for a for loop. And in this case, we have our for loop set for Pandora's Box, because we have 2 different sequences. I'm running the memory game on one sequence and the target game on the second sequence. And I'm just going to keep them all in order for that object, which is fine. So when we stop every single sequence, as you can see in this for loop here. So we're going from 1 to games count, and in this case, there's 2 games. So sequence set state I. So this would, the first time this runs, this would be 1. The second time it runs, obviously I would up to 2, and then so on. It would keep incrementing up until we get to the end of the game's count, and we stop that sequence. We also go through and we reset all of the devices in Pandora's Box. Now, Pandora's Box is nice in the sense where it doesn't really care. I could say 1 to 5,000 to Pandora's Box, and even if only 5 layers exist, it'll still reset all 5 of those layers, and it'll just stop there. It doesn't give us any errors if we try and reset other layers that don't exist. It's very, very nice of it to do. Sorry, it's our friend. And then we have our switch. This is the switch we were talking about. So the variable that I'm taking in is the game, which is being set here. So it's being passed from another script into as an argument into this macro. So I'm saying if the game, or in the case that the game says memory, then run the memory reset game. In the case that it's target, do target new game. So let's look inside of target new game and what we're doing inside of target new game. We can close this, and then we also debug. I can get rid of that line. This is just giving us in our console. It's giving us a what the game is. It's just printing that for us in our console. We can leave that there. So in our target new game, we have the starting script, which, so after all the sequences have stopped, we need to obviously go back and tell Pandora's Box which sequence we want to start and to go to Q1. So in this case, there's sequence 2. You can see here, sequence 2, Q1, and that's where all of our targets are. So there we go. There's our first Q. So we'll go back in and we'll look at that. This is still the new game. We are setting the score to 0. We're setting the score in the variable to 0, and we're setting it in Pandora's Box to 0. So this is just a text layer and a text asset. We'll look into that in a moment as well. And then we start the game by putting target next. So it will put a target in this area. So let's look at what happens now when we click on the target. So it sees the targets, and from before, we're actually using the same script as the original memory game, where we take the value from Pandora's Box. So this is the Pandora's Box interaction input node. So when I mouse over this, we can see the device ID says 24. If I leave it, it goes back to 1. So device ID 24, 0. And the site ID goes to 1. So when I click this, we're sending that 24. I'm storing this variable into a global variable. So we can see variable output. So that number, the device number, goes to a global variable. And when we click on it, we see mouse left here, the left button, when we click it, it goes to 1. So when we're saying when mouse left equals 1, then we run the layer interaction script. And I also have, if it equals 0, don't do anything. So if selected layer doesn't equal 0, then run the layer interaction. The reason for that is if you click on the background, then it will try and execute the node with the background of 0 here. So I'm telling it, don't do anything if it's 0. So we'll open the layer interaction node, and we've got another switch in here. So this is if I'll bring up that variable now. Bear with me here for a moment. So I'm going to print this in here again. So when that button gets clicked, it goes to the JSON variable and pulls this value, game mode. So get game mode. Well, here it is. So once it gets the game mode as a string, it tests, is it memory or is it target? If it is target, let's run the target hit, the target hit macro. Perfect. So there it's running the target hit macro because the game mode is target. So, and as we can see here, we have our variables updating every time we click a button. So let's look at what's happening there. So you can see that this is starting to count down, and some of these numbers are disappearing. And let's look at why that's happening. So when we hit a target, I've got everything commented here. This looks a bit, not scary, but it looks a bit different. So everything inside of these stars are comments in a lot of the things that I write. I can't recommend commenting enough. If you come back to a project, any project, whether it's in Widget Designer or any other language that you're using, you're going to learn a lot. You're going to be developing yourself and your skills over many years. And if you come back to this in 5 or 6 years, or even a year from now, after you've built something for a client, hey, we want to add something. When you're writing it today, you're going to think to yourself, I'll remember what this means. This is very obvious. It doesn't work that way. So commenting is always best practice. And even if it's a bad comment, even if it's bad, it's better than nothing. So right now we have these comments to get started. So the first thing we do is we assign the global variable of the layer number to a local variable. This is the same thing that we've done in the memory game, because it happens very fast. If you're moving your mouse over top of different layers, by the time that this executes, this number could change. So when this disappears, that just went to 0. So if your script takes a few seconds to run, or let's say half a second to run, well, that target just went away, and your variable went from layer 24 to 0. So all of these scripts in here are going to be trying to pull from a variable that, okay, this is layer 24, and that's great. But as soon as it flips away, your cursor isn't on it anymore, and it will return as 0 for all of these. So if I were to put selected layer into here, in this area or this area, it's going to try and execute this script with that layer of 0. So the easiest way to make sure that doesn't happen is to store that as a local variable inside of this script, instead of this macro, so that doesn't happen. Because once this local variable is created, then it persists. So now this selected, as soon as this runs, this selected layer can change 100 times. As long as we don't run hit target equals selected layer again after that selected layer changes, it'll stay as the original number. So now we can go on to the next line here, which is target score. So we're pulling the target score from that JSON variable again, so we can work with it. Okay, now we have which layer is hit. So the reason that we have 5 different versions of this is because of the location of these targets. So we want the center one here to flip backwards, and we want the one on the right to flip to the right. So if we didn't have these ranges, these would all flip in the incorrect direction. So 16 to 18 are the ones at the top. So if I tell it to rotate to 90 degrees and I click it, we're going to see target hits. We'd see it flip in the wrong direction. Oh, we won't, because okay. So we can see the one on the right side here. Let's make it come back up. This one flips, okay. If I change this one was minus 90. If I change this one to, let's say, Y angle, that'll be more apparent. You can see it goes sideways. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's not consistent with the rest of the widget. So we can change this back to X and carry on. So that's the reason we have all of these if ranges. And if we go back to our if statement operators, we have is equal to or greater than 16, and at the same time has to be less than or equal to 18. So that in this case, that means if it's 16, 17, or 18, this is true. If it's more than that or less than that, then this one will return false. So we flip the target down, and then we add to the score. So it's a single line, plus equals 10. And in the case of the moving target, because it's moving, we're adding 25 to that score. And then now we have in here, if the target is, if the layer that was hit is in between 16 and 24, then we go to the next target. And the reason we have that one is because the score layer is actually layer 25. So if you were to click the button, it would actually increment that and think that a target was hit when you clicked anywhere in the area of this text box. And then in the end here we have we're storing our score back to the JSON variable, and we're updating the Pandoras Box text resource. So we'll look at the Pandoras Box text resource now. So we can see resource set text 101 1 target score. So what does that mean? So if we go into Pandoras Box, we can see our text asset, which has a value, a folder value of 101 and a file value of 1. So we'll go to our text input editor, and we can see that, well, there it is. That's our text that's up here. And when we update it from Widget Designer into Pandoras Box, it automatically updates this. We can change it in here to UK 121 and update. We click update, and it will update it on the screen. And our Widget Designer tells Pandoras Box to do that automatically. And you can use a literal, or you can use a variable, which we're doing in this case. So we're using a variable, which is target score, which we initially set up here, variable target score, and the target score equals the JSON variable. And then we're incrementing the target score as we go. Once that's all done, whichever one of these executes as true, then we update the target score to Pandoras Box. So if we go like this, resource set, and I can put something in, you win, if we put it in quotes, now we're declaring a literal. So a literal is something that we're directly declaring. We're not pulling it from a variable. So if I test this, Shift Control T is to test just this line. So now we can see it inserts you win directly into that text asset. Just a quick rundown of how Pandoras Box and Widget Designer can talk back and forth for scores like this. Okay, so if we want to start the game over again, there we go, and it sets this back to 0 and adds the target. So we have the target. What we know now what happens when the target gets hit. So there we go. We're upping it by 25, by 10 each time. The targets flip up, and we're good to go. So how does the new target come up? And why is this list getting smaller? So let's look at the target practice next target. So this is how we set the new targets. Pop up the next targets. So in the very top here, I have a list or an array of numbers. These numbers all coincide with a layer. So we can see in Pandoras Box, layer 16, we'll bring this back up into the sequence. Layer 16 is the first target, layer 24 is the last target. And if we go through all of these numbers, we can see that these are all the targets that are brought up. So that's great, we know it's working. We can, by using a list like this, we could use any layers in Pandoras Box. They don't even have to be beside each other. So if we wanted to use layer 100, let's say, we would just put 100, and now this is a valid way of storing all of the numbers of which layers are being used. We could just use layer 1 to 8, 1 to 9. In this case, we're not doing that because the translation settings on the translation settings on these layers have been modified, and that's because the flipping up and the flipping down of the targets, it doesn't quite look or feel right if they're delayed. So in Pandoras Box, and this is getting a little into the advanced settings here. I'm going to remove this target 100 here, and we'll get back to that in a moment. So in Pandoras Box, if I click on the actual device itself and go into the inspector, we have these parameter smoothing values here. So we can see 500, 500 again, and this is to smooth this 500 milliseconds. Sorry. So if we actually take one of these layers and grab the here we go. This is the top. So we can move things. It goes very quickly. And we can see it. I can flick this up and down very quickly, and it's going to it's going to move. I know this is on a webinar, so it's probably the refresh rate isn't as quick and clean as it could be, but it is smooth. Suffice to say, it is smooth. So if I move this all the way over to the right and click reset, we can see it moves to the center. So click reset and it slides to the center. If I were to reset this layer, if I were to set the transition smoothing of the X position to 0 and do the same thing with that layer again. So now I can move this layer back over to the right. And if I click reset, it just pops into the center. So the transition smoothing, it's for a lot of things, especially lighting consoles, because this is such a fine movement in Pandoras Box that if you start sending 8-bit position settings from a lighting console, from Widget Designer, other places as well, when you start doing that, it gets very jumpy. You try and do a smooth fade and it'll jump, everything will jump across the screen. So with Pandoras Box, we have the option to smooth that out. And that's exactly what we're doing. So I'll change this back to 500. So these are global settings here. So that will change the transition smoothing, parameter smoothing of every single layer for every single parameter of X, Y, and Z or Z for each of the position, rotation, and scale. You can also open up the individual parameters, and we can open, let's say, one of these layers that we're using for the targets, and you can see just for the target, I've changed the rotation to 0 for the smoothing for just these target layers. If I go to the other layers that I'm using for the memory game, you can see that they're still at 500 milliseconds. So that's the reason that we're using different layers that aren't the same ones we're using for the memory game. In case anyone's wondering, because of course we could be efficient and reuse these layers because we're just going to, obviously we're not going to show the memory game and the target game at the same time. There's no real point in that. So if we click start new target game, that resets all of our layers and puts everything back to 0, let's say. So back on track now. Next target. So what happens is we have an array set with all the layer numbers that we're going to use, and now we know why we're using unique layers and not the original layers that we were using before. And we're going to get a random number. So to get the random number, I've actually got a function to return the random number for us. So to do that, let's open up this function. Again, it's not that bad, believe me. So we have the function here, target get new random number, or get new random, and we have the size that we want it to get. So in here we have target.count. So I'm actually counting the number of positions or integers inside of this target array, because that's how many positions that I need to randomize. So we'll go back to this function. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to load this array here, or this list here, into our function as a local variable, and our last random target. This is kind of just more for display purposes. We're not using that for our logic really, but just so we can see what's happening. So we're saying local array equals this list here. Perfect. Okay. So the first thing we do is we check how big that size is of that array, and we say, okay, if there are no values in this array, then do this. If the array is not empty, carry on. So when we look at this array size, right now it's going to return as 2. So we can see we have 2 positions left. If we click this again, we have 1 position left. If we click it again, now it's 0. So it's the next time we click it, we will run this part here. So what is going to happen is we're going to resize this array, and resizing is exactly that. So we just create however many positions we want. So if we want an array of 1,000 positions, of course we type in 1,000 here. But in this case, I'm going to use that argument that we passed from before, the size, and we'll set this to the same size as the array of layers that we have, because that's how many randomized numbers we need. Once it's been resized, we use the next function here to generate unique random integers into this array. So we take that array here, we tell it what number we want to start with, and we tell it the number that we want it to end with. Now, remember that arrays are always zero base. So we start counting from 0 and up to whatever number we have. So in the case of this, we have 9 layers in here. So we can see 16 through 24. So we've got 9, 16 through 24 inclusive, equals 9. So our array is 9. Our layer, sorry, I'll open this back up again, target practice, target next. This array is 9 long, 9 positions long, but we want 0 to count as the first one. So that's why we have the -1 here, because if I say I want to create it the same size, it'll actually be one number too many. So in this case, because this is 9, this is going to pass the targets.count. Oops, sorry. The targets.count will be counting from here, here, passing 9 to this argument. We'll take 9 in because that's how big we want it. And we want this to count from 0 to 8, not 0 to 9, which is why we have the -1. And once that's done, we go to the next function that we have in here. So we want to extract the random number from the first position in the array. So that will be, let's say, let's click this again. Here we go. So in this case, our next position will be 4. That's our 0 position of this array. So if we click this, there, it just selected number 4. And then the next line, it deletes the first position in that array. So again, 0 based, so that's the first position. We want to also remove or delete the first position, and then carry on. So again, this is just for us to be able to see the last target is this number in here in the JSON. So we're setting that last target to the random number, which is again, the local array 0. So it'll be this one. And then we save the whole array back to the JSON again, so we can pull it back the next time we want to look at it for the next target that's hit. And just so it's all pretty, we run the text box.1. We set the text back to this game JSON variable here. And once this whole thing is done, at the very end, we return the random value back to whatever called it. So we can go back to, and this is how functions work. I think we're going to be doing, shortly we'll be doing another webinar on how functions and macros work, where to use and where to use which one. So we're setting this variable random from this function. So what we were just looking at, this whole function runs, it gets the number, and then it returns that number. When all the work is done, it passes the number back to whatever called it. So in this case, we have a variable that called that function. So we're getting that number back in place of this. And then what we do next is we use that number as an index. So we have our targets array, which we declared at the very top. And we have our random number in here that we set in from this function. So now we have this index, so targets index, and let's say it's 0, so that would be layer 16, 1 would be layer 17, and so on. So that's the part that's randomized. And then we have the opposite of the target hit. So if it's 19 to 21, it flips up this layer from the X position, and so on. So this should be all familiar as well. The only thing we're missing here is the score. So where we had it go from 0 to 90, now we're going from 100 to 0. So we're flipping it from hidden to being shown. And then at the very end, we have we're setting the JSON here again. We're actually doing that twice, so this actually doesn't need to be done, but we're doing it 2 times just to make sure it does happen. So now we have we've gone through all of these now, all of our functions here. So when we click this, and again, we're not using last target, but it is for us to kind of see what's happening. So we know that that 0, index 0 is the last one that was called. And if we look here, this is our position 0 on our random target list. So if we click this number was just used and deleted from the list. This is the next number that's going to be used and deleted from the list. So if we click it now, we'll see 3 popped up here and it disappeared from this list. So we know for sure every time we click one of these targets, we almost always get a random number. That's in all the testing I've been doing. That's the first time I've seen one of these pop up in the same place. And of course that makes sense because it is randomized. So there is a small chance that the last number is going to be the same as the first number when you randomize this again. And at the moment, we don't have, I don't have an end to the game, so you can just keep going. We could add a timer in the future. We could add a max score, so you get to 1,000 and the game ends and you win a prize. So this is for, I would use something like an air scan with this kind of game, and maybe a stress ball. So you're throwing a stress ball, hopefully at a durable LED wall, and you have targets that are flipping up and flipping down, and you're incrementing your score. And if you want to start a new game, you click on Start New Game, and it'll reset your everything to 0. Now, because we have this randomized list like this, we can add a new target that will also be random. So now you can click on any target, and it'll keep randomizing itself. So if you have, let's say you've got kids playing or something, and they need a little bit more on the wall to be able to hit, or you've got 2 players, you can also add another target. And for the most part, they're going to stay randomized. Again, we're going to have, when our array starts over again, there is the chance that we will have the same numbers pop up, but we could program some more logic to make sure that doesn't happen. But for the purpose of this game is just to kind of keep it simple and to show what is possible, and the fact that we can have in about 45 minutes we can have a game like this on connecting Widget Designer and Pandoras Box together. So that just about wraps everything up. As I said, it'd be quick and simple this time. So this is our, and now we can see this is what our JSON file looks like, a JSON variable, just for the target part. And yeah, I don't think I see any questions. Janina, are there any questions?
I do have one question, something that occurred to me. Okay, in your target hit and in the target next scripts, you got all those if statements. Did you make them single if statements by design, or is there a reason why you decided against using else if?
Not really. I mean, I could have, yes, and then you're right, it would exit out. I just made them if statements. Because there's no chance of one of these layers being 2 things, which is why I just used if statements instead of else if. Because yeah, if we use else if, then it would exit as soon as it gets to that. But yes, you're right. It would be more efficient to use else if in this case.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you.
Okay. Well, if there's no other questions at the moment, that kind of concludes our target practice Widget Designer Gamification webinar. We'll stay online for a little bit in case anyone does come up with any questions. And if that does, please feel free to throw them into the question section in this webinar, or you can email our support team, or post in our forum. If you've got any other ideas for any games that we can do, please, that's more than welcome. Any ideas are more than welcome for our next webinars if there's anything you'd like to see. Also, you can go to our forum at forum.coolux.de and make some requests for webinars, for games. Our help file is also very good, very helpful. The people who maintain it are excellent at doing so. Even though I use Widget Designer and Pandoras Box every day for my job, I always have a tab open with the help file there. It's a great resource for help. So have a great day and stay safe, everyone. And thank you for watching.